So if we kind of take a look at the board here, I've drawn, I'm trying to draw out kind of what these muscle cells look like. Again, if you have an anatomy book or any other kind of images or a physiology book in front of you, I would recommend, that you go to the respective pages where these images are at. Like for example, on page 305 or 278, in was it Merriam-Webster's textbook. Also, those of you who are my students watching right now, I have emailed out PowerPoints as well, so you can follow along on those. But basically, when we want to, as I mentioned in previous videos, when it comes to understanding histology, you have to look at and differentiating between tissues. You have to look at the shapes, the morphologic characteristics of the cells. The shapes, the size, and realistically where the nuclei are located. Okay, or how many nuclei are even present in the cell. All right. Now, when it comes to muscle, as we discussed in the previous video, like I said, these cells are no different. You have to look at the different shapes of the muscle cells, the length of the muscle cells, the color patterns on the muscle cells. All right. So, for example, you can see skeletal muscle here. Skeletal muscle is, remember, the longest cell. The longest type of muscle cell. Okay. And, in terms of length, skeletal muscle cells run, they can be upwards of 30 centimeters in length, okay? As I mentioned before, a good way to really think of the length of a muscle cell, think of a muscle itself. When you look at the belly of a muscle, whether it is a muscle in your forearm or a muscle in your thigh, or, a muscle in your arm, whatever it may be, okay, when you're looking at, pictures in your book, you're looking at a cadaver, or if you're looking at images somewhere else of actual real muscles in a body, remember, when you look at the belly, the meat of that muscle, okay, the cells run the entire length of that. So the length of the belly of a muscle is going to be the length of the cells as well. Okay, so that's how long skeletal muscle cells are. And there are some muscles in the body that are upwards of 30 centimeters in length. So the cells are also going to be that length as well. Okay. When it comes to diameter or thickness, skeletal muscle cells can be anywhere from 10 to 100 micrometers or microns in diameter. Again, just depending on the overall size of the muscle. All right. Now, just kind of on a side note, if I say it's 10 to 100 microns in diameter, you're thinking, okay, great. What does that mean to me? It's just a number in some unit I've probably never heard of before. Okay, if you want to make this size, this micrometer, this micron, if you want to make it relatable, take a dime. Okay, take a second to grab a dime. Okay, and hold the dime. So the pads of your fingers, the pads of your index finger and your thumb are on each face, are on each side of the dime. Okay, and then look at how thick that dime is, the diameter of that dime. Okay, now how thick that dime is. Okay, that is 1 millimeter. Okay, that's about 1 millimeter. Now, bear in mind, there are about 1,000, there are 1,000 micrometers, okay, in the width of that dime. Okay, so there's 1,000 micrometers in 1 millimeter. All right, so let's say a skeletal muscle is 10 micrometers in diameter. How many, if you pile them on top of each other, like blocks on top of each other, okay, how many skeletal muscle cells diameters could you fit into the width of that dime? Okay, you could fit 100 in there, right? Okay, because just add a 0. 10 times 100 is 1,000. All right, so you could pack upwards of, in terms of thickness, if you stack them all on top of each other like so, you can get upwards of 100 small skeletal muscle cells in the width of the dime. Okay, so keep that in mind when you're thinking about these small size units. That's just a good way to relate, again, these small microscopic units to something more practical that you're used to seeing. Okay, so again, now another thing with skeletal muscles and cardiac muscle as well is that they are striated muscle cells. Okay, when we say they're striated, you see alternating patterns of light and dark, light and dark, light and dark. And again, as I mentioned before, these light and dark patterns are created by the arrangement of the contractile proteins of the sarcomere. Okay, the sarcomere is the functional contractile unit of the muscle cell. Remember, when we say functional unit, we're saying the smallest part of a machine, the smallest part of an object that gives function. Okay, so the smallest working part of a muscle is the sarcomere. Okay, the individual contractile proteins alone can't do their job. But if you arrange them in a parallel, kind of alternating fashion with borders around them, you develop a sarcomere. Now those proteins can work together to slide by each other and contract. Okay, that's a functional unit. Okay, so basically, one thing to keep in mind is that skeletal muscle and cardiac muscle both are made up of the same types of sarcomeres, the same kind of contractile units. Okay, they have the same contractile mechanisms. Okay, what's really different though about how a skeletal muscle and a cardiac muscle contracts is how you excite the tissue to get it to contract. Okay, there's a couple of extra different steps involved in cardiac muscle contraction than there are in skeletal muscle. But once you get beyond those first few initial steps, the mechanisms are exactly the same. Which we'll talk about later on in other videos, excitation, contraction, coupling, the contraction, the relaxation. There's a little variability there too. Okay, but in general, the contractile mechanisms are the same. All right. Now, another thing you'll notice, I use these little black, line circles, whatever you want to call them, to represent the nucleus, okay, or I should say the nuclei of skeletal muscle. Remember that skeletal muscle cells are multinucleated, okay, they're multinucleated, and that's just because they're in embryonic development. When we develop skeletal muscles, okay, they develop from what were called satellite cells that fuse together to form these kind of long cells, okay, so these are just remnants of embryonic cells is really what you're seeing. All right, so, and that's advantageous as well because, remember, the whole point of the nucleus is to store DNA for protein synthesis, all right? If we had one nucleus centrally located in that muscle cell, but we had to replace proteins that were, 15 centimeters away from that nucleus, it would take forever to replace those proteins. So it's kind of nice having all these, various nuclei all over the place, all right? So that's skeletal muscle in a nutshell. And remember that skeletal muscle is also voluntary. Okay, now remember when I say it's voluntary, that means we have conscious control over it. Okay, but skeletal muscle though won't, think of skeletal muscle won't really contract unless you've got a motor neuron going to that muscle fiber to stimulate it to contract. Okay, so keep that in mind as well. All right, and I'll talk more in depth later on about motor units and neuromuscular junction and things like that. Okay. Now, cardiac muscle, all right, cardiac muscle cells are they're much shorter. Than skeletal muscle, but they are bigger than smooth muscle cells. Okay, but in terms of diameter, they're upwards about similar thickness to skeletal muscles. Okay, on average, maybe a hair thicker on average. All right. Now, cardiac muscle cells are short and they're branched. Okay, they're short and they're branched. So that means there's a lot of space in between cardiac muscle cells, and remember, connective tissue, occupies those spaces. Okay. Now, one thing you're going to notice when you look at the skeletal muscle cells, it's very easy to see the borders from cell to cell because there are these structures called intercalated discs that are in between each individual cardiac muscle cell. All right, which is, and that's important to identify when you're looking at, when you're doing a histology lab and you're looking at cardiac muscle tissue underneath the microscope. Okay, because again, think of this as the border from cell to cell. Okay, the kind of the fence between cell to cell. All right, now these intercalated discs are important because there are anchoring proteins that help hold these cells together during contraction, and there's also there's ion channels in here that allow for the flow of ions from muscle cell to muscle cell. That's important when we're talking about the conductance of an action potential. We'll talk much more in depth about that later on. Okay, but that's how you tell. It's one of the main ways you can take a look at cardiac muscle, the short branch nature of it, and the intercalated discs. Okay, with these little anchoring proteins and ion channels in there. Now, another thing to keep in mind is that cardiac muscle cells are, there's one nucleus per cell. Okay, they're uninucleated. All right, so one nucleus per cell, and they're, the nuclei in cardiac muscle are very similar to that of skeletal muscle, and that the nucleus is very peripheral, meaning it's a lot towards the outside of the cell, okay, which is fairly different compared to most other cells of the human body, okay, except for adipocytes, cells of adipose tissue nucleus of adipocytes are towards the periphery as well, okay. So keep that in mind, that cardiac muscle, short and branch, peripheral nuclei, separated but yet joined together by these intercalated discs. Okay, and also bear in mind that cardiac muscle is unconscious. Okay, we unconsciously regulate cardiac muscle tissue. Okay, it automatically kind of regulates itself with, all kind of on its own, and also with the help of the autonomic nervous system. All right, and then smooth muscle. Smooth muscle, remember, are made up of very small cells in length and diameter, about 5 to 10 microns in diameter and 30 to about 200 microns in length, okay? So these are definitely, much smaller in comparison to skeletal and cardiac muscle. But when you look at the organization of smooth muscle, you typically see lots of different cells kind of very densely packed together to form these large sheets, okay? Because a good way to think of the location of smooth muscle, think of smooth muscle as lining hollow organs or openings, okay? Because we use smooth muscle to control the diameter of blood vessels. We use smooth muscle to control the openings between hollow organs, like the sphincters between the stomach and the small intestine, or the esophagus and the stomach, or the internal sphincter, that from the urinary bladder to the urethra and so on. Okay, you find smooth muscle in pretty thick sheets lining the GI tract. All right, and again, like any other muscle, it's designed to contract and shorten. But what's unique about smooth muscle is that smooth muscle, even though it's made up of many individual cells kind of piled together in a thick layer, it tends to behave like one singular unit. Okay, so the cells are all going to contract and relax at the same time. Okay, when stimulated to do so. So as a result, that's just kind of cool about that. And the end result of that is going to be, the constriction or dilation of a blood vessel, the peristaltic movements of an intestine to move the food you're digesting around the 20 some odd feet of itself. Okay, whereas cardiac muscle cells, when they contract, okay, they shorten. One cardiac muscle cell is going to contract, and then it's going to relay that action potential to the next one, and then the next one, and then the next one, and it'll eventually behave as a singular unit as well. Whereas skeletal muscle, when skeletal muscle contracts, what's interesting about this is that when we go to lift an object, okay, we're not going to use every single skeletal muscle cell to pick up an object. No, I'm holding a handful of markers. I don't need to waste energy to curl my bicep and my brachialis to lift all these markers. They're just not that heavy. So your nervous system is only going to stimulate only a few skeletal muscle cells to contract at a time. Okay, but if I'm lifting a heavier object, like this chair, that's going to require more strength, and I'm going to recruit more muscle cells to contract. Okay, so based on the load that we're applying to skeletal muscles, okay, certain numbers of skeletal muscles are going to contract. Okay, whereas cardiac and smooth muscle tend to, even though they're made up of individual cells, tend to behave as singular units. Okay, like they're one unit, like it's one big singular unit of tissue. Okay. So again, when it comes to looking at these muscle cells, you have to again pay attention to the morphological differences between them. Again, skeletal muscle cells, very long, okay, fairly thick, with a little bit of space in between the muscle cells, which is again occupied by connective tissue. Okay, cardiac muscle cells are short and branched, connected and bordered by intercalated discs. Single nucleus versus skeletal muscle that's multinucleated. And remember, both of these are striated. They're both made of the exact same contractile sarcomeres, okay? And smooth muscle is smooth, okay? It has, you don't see the sarcomeres within smooth muscle, hence the smooth appearance, okay?